The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Georgetown law professor Peter Edelman explains how the justice system punishes the poor and rewards the rich. Former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps says pending media mergers will give big business even more influence on what we see and hear. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Just before the end of the year, Attorney General Jeff Sessions revoked an Obama-era administration guideline that advised local courts against imposing excessive fines and fees on poor people. The issue attracted wide attention after an investigation into the practice in Ferguson, Missouri, raised concerns of a, quote, modern-day debtor's prison, close quote. It also attracted the attention of Georgetown University law professor Peter Edelman, who wrote a book about the issue titled, Not a Crime to be Poor: The Criminalization of Poverty in America. And we say hello to Peter Edelman, professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University, where he teaches constitutional law and poverty law, and is faculty director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. His latest book is Not a Crime to be Poor: The Criminalization of Poverty in America. Peter Edelman, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
My pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You document a system in which the legal system extorts unreasonable fees and fines from poor people. What is the extent of the problem?
The problem is really national. We kind of woke up as a country that this was going on when we had Ferguson. Of course, the initial headline was the killing of Michael Brown, and that was shocking. Although we knew that there were far too many instances of African American men who were unarmed and were killed by police officers. But the other thing that happened with Ferguson, we found out that they were absolutely squeezing their own people who live in the city because of the problem that the city had of an unwillingness to have higher taxes at all levels that are important for them, including the city itself. So they got money by arresting people at an enormous rate for trumped up violations and putting them in jail. Well, we got a national report about that, a report for the nation from the Department of Justice, and we found out that this was going on around the country. There were lawyers out there doing great work, but we didn't understand that this until then that all of these things taken together constitute a national problem.
Now, of course, most of us are familiar, at least from reading, about the bail system, where you put up cash to ensure you will show up for trial. But it doesn't quite work like that, does it? How should that work?
How it should work is that people should be released on their own recognizance if they are not a flight risk. They should be able to be at home until their whatever they're accused of comes up for trial. And in fact, there are people in various states and around the country where that's being done. In fact, it's an old idea. Robert Kennedy, for whom I worked when he was Attorney General, pursued just this kind of an idea, working with the Vera Institute, which was created then and is now still with us and doing great work. And the District of Columbia has had that kind of a system for all of that period of time since the 1970s, and it works generally well. So we know what to do. It's not simple, but one of the things that's happened in recent times is that a foundation called the Arnold Foundation has been working on developing a system that's computerized and based on a lot of data, and it's been put into place in a number of places, Kentucky, Maryland, others, and it works. It's essentially statistically, it's based on statistical experience. So we've had those things happening in legislature, and also we've had in the last couple of years litigation that has declared in some parts of the country the whole bail system as unconstitutional. So we're working on that. But what happens is, I mean, first of all, let me give you a national number. There are 11.7 million people who go through our jails every year. 700,000 people who are in a jail around the country on any given day. 3/5 of those people, and this is the key point. 3/5 of those people are not guilty of anything. They're waiting to be tried, and those people are the vast majority of those people are people who are in there because they can't afford the money bail. And while they're there, terrible things happen, and to the point where people commit suicide and they lose their jobs in large number, and things happen in their families and all of that. And there's just no justification for it. And the whole system. One major reason why they continue to do this is because the authorities don't have the personnel to give everybody a trial. And so the way that what they do is they weed them out by holding them there when the only choice they have, if they want to get out since they can't pay the bail, is to plead guilty when they're not. And so that saves the court time. It raises money for the jurisdiction because they then have a payment plan that's set up for them. And by the way, also because they've pleaded guilty, there are collateral consequences that are absolutely horrible. There are 45,000 various kinds of things that people are banned from doing one way or another across the country, the individual examples and laws. So it's about employment, it's about housing, in many places it's about voting, and it is so that's another way in which it stays with people all the way through their lives, in addition to owing money that they can't pay. And we should remember also that many places in the country charge fees to stay in the jail. So that gets added to it. It's called pay to stay, and in prisons too. And we have for-profit entities. We have 13 states have for-profit probation agencies, and they are collecting these fees to do nothing except collect money. And sad to say, it's also true of a lot of public probation agencies as well. So all of these kind of go together. The money bail is sort of a major linchpin in this whole system of how people are injured so badly.
Well, and with these excessive financial penalties that are imposed on low-level offenders are being used to pay for a jail system that's run by for-profit companies. Should the government run the judicial system?
Well, yes, the for-profit is a huge problem in and of itself. But if we were to wipe out the for-profit, and things have happened. Georgia recently made it so tough on the for-profit companies in Georgia. They've been the leading for-profit in the country. A company called Sentinel earlier in the year 2017 left the country in Georgia because they said quite candidly that they weren't making money there. So they could be squeezed out and pushed out, but it's not easy because they have a lot of political clout. Now, you asked a bigger question, which is shouldn't the government pay the cost of running the criminal justice system? Of course they should, but is it just or unjust the way they do it? And in too many places, there are issues, serious issues of running a system that really has been kind of the evil twin of massive incarceration. We're quite aware of mass incarceration. We're 2.2 million people in our prisons and jails in the country, minimum sentences and 3 strikes and you're out, and all the other things that's very much related to race as well. And then we find out there's this evil twin that's enmeshed these millions of people who are in there for really solely for the purpose of squeezing them to get money to run the court system. That's just unacceptable.
Unbelievable and very sobering. The book is Not a Crime to be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America. I suggest everybody go out and read that. Peter Edelman is the author. He's a professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University and, of course, our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Peter, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
I would like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps explains why the current FCC may be the worst he has ever seen, but the best for big business control of our nation's media. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
From 1776 forward, the common yeoman, America's middle class, has been hailed as the virtuous heart and backbone of our nation. How ironic, since it took 150 years before we actually created a broad middle class. Before the 1930s, most Americans were poor or near poor. And yes, created is the correct term for how our middle class came to be. pushed by two historic forces of social transformation. First, the devastation of the Great Depression created a grassroots rebellion of labor, farmers, and others against the careless moneyed class that caused the 1929 crash. These forces produced FDR and his New Deal of union rights, Social Security, and other tools that empowered ordinary Americans to begin rising up from poverty. Second, the government's national mobilization for World War II created an explosion of new jobs and opportunities for millions, opening people's eyes, boosting confidence, and raising expectations. A post-war rise in unionism, passage of the GI Bill, a housing program, and other progressive actions led to a doubling of the median family income in only 30 years, creating a middle class that included nearly 60% of Americans by the late 1970s. Then, poof! Washington's commitment to a middle class suddenly fizzled in the 1980s as Republicans and many Democrats switched from supporting egalitarianism to backing the elitism of their corporate donors. Ever since, they steadily disempowered workers and enthroned the rich, thus imposing today's abominable, un-American culture of inequality across our land. This is Jim Hightower saying, just as progressives deliberately push public policies to create the middle class, so are today's economic royalists deliberately pushing plutocratic policies to destroy it. That is the momentous struggle that calls us to action in this political year.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Michael J. Copps was an FCC Commissioner from 2001 to 2011 and currently heads the Media and Democracy Reform Initiative at Common Cause. And we say hello to Michael J. Copps, who was an FCC Commissioner from 2001 to 2011, currently heads the Media and Democracy Reform Initiative at Common Cause. Michael Copps, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you and your listeners.
And certainly our pleasure to have you with us. You know, the FCC, under Commissioner Ajit Pai's leadership, has made several moves that could reshape our media landscape. Among them is the elimination of a rule that prevents cross-ownership of a newspaper, radio station, or television station in the same market. What's the significance of this ruling?
Well, I think it's how much power we are willing to accord one company in a specific area. If you're a business person who owns a TV station, or maybe a couple of TV stations in a market, and you own the newspaper too, you've got pretty much a lock on influencing public opinion in your market. It's your news information, your opinions that are going to be listened to. And you've also got a lock on the revenue stream. If you stop and think about it, small advertising, the combination, the paper and the TV stations gives the company the ability to jack up rates. That kind of locks out small advertisers. It's bad all the way around, and most of all, it's bad for our civic dialogue not to have a diversity of opinion. Imagine you're in a small station somewhere in some market, and a company like Sinclair comes along and buys you out, and maybe they hollow out your newsroom, but at a minimum, they move management to their headquarters out in suburban Baltimore. Then they write op-eds or editorials that they expect your local anchorman to read on TV. And that's the drumbeat you hear, and that replaces diversity, diversity of source, diversity of opinion, diversity of ownership, certainly. So the job of the FCC is to figure out how all these mergers and acquisitions advance the public interest, and I'm at a loss to see how something like that advances the public interest.
But, you know, in voting to make the change, the FCC stated that it would help promote, quote, ownership diversity in the broadcast industry, close quote. How does that make sense?
I mean, I have to get that back. How does that make sense? It makes no sense when you're moving it to you're moving that ownership to corporate headquarters, far removed from the local market. You're not talking to your local population about the programs they want to appear. You're not carrying local public affairs, what's going on with the school board or the town council or anything like that. It doesn't add to diversity. It adds to the uniformity of the marketplace. When we were looking at radio and Clear Channel and all of that, I used to make the point you can turn on your car radio in Los Angeles, California, and drive across the whole United States of America to the East Coast, and you'll hear by and large the same music, the same stuff. Well, if you had real diversity, you'd go through different areas and you'd have bluegrass or blues or Motown or all kinds of different things. That would be diversity, not the same top 40 list played everywhere in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Sinclair Broadcasting a moment ago, and one of the mergers that has gone through involves Sinclair Broadcasting buying Tribune Media. And it's one that you say we should be particularly alarmed about. Why?
Well, it's still up for a decision of the FCC. A decision is expected very, very soon. It would make Sinclair the largest, it would have the largest viewership in the United States of America. It would appear in some 270 some markets. We have an ownership cap right now where no one company should be able to reach more than, I think it's 39%. This would take it way up in the 60s or 70s and just give it tremendous influence, and that's bad with any company. But when you've got one that's not really known for diversity of news or diversity of opinion, that's writing those editorials in suburban Baltimore and expecting their local anchor woman to read them out in the local station far, far away, that's just not good for the country.
We're speaking with Michael Copps, former FCC Commissioner and currently heads the Media and Democracy Reform Initiative at Common Cause, here today on americasdemocrats.org. Another issue that you've been working on at Common Cause, Michael, involves political ads and sponsorship identification. What do the rules say now, and where do they fall short?
Well, it's a really important issue that not too many people have heard of, but the statute, Section 317 of the Telecommunications Act, requires broadcasters to identify the sponsor of anything that's broadcast, and that includes commercial things, so like Campbell's Soup, it has to, obviously is identified. But when it comes to political ads, and they are covered by Section 317, the requirements have not been really implemented. So you can get by, and then they run that little banner under the political ad that says, brought to you by Citizens for Motherhood and Apple Pie, or Citizens for the American Flag. And that's all it says. And that could be paid for by a chemical company that's polluting the Chesapeake Bay or deforesting something where they shouldn't be doing that. And the American people don't know. And they have a right, and the courts have said they have a right to know by whom they are trying to be persuaded. That law has been on the books, but it just hasn't been implemented. It was kind of updated a little bit in the 60s. But what we have to do now is to implement the law. The law is there. All the FCC has to do is update the rules to take account of all of the dark hidden money and the PACs and everything that have developed in the last 20 or 25 years. And it could do that by simply announcing, we're going to put out this notice. Here's the formula that we're going to require for people to identify themselves. If it's, identify the three largest contributors to who really ran that ad, or some kind of a formula. It's not rocket science to work that out. And then the people would know who's trying to buy their vote or persuade them to vote a certain way. And that's the essence of democracy. And now it gets even more complicated in the Internet age, because you and I are reading stories now where some of these companies are going to be able to direct an ad just toward you or just toward me, and they know because of the lack of privacy on the internet and the technology and the way it's advanced, what our particular issues and concerns are. So I don't know how you grope with that. There's some legislation pending that would probably put the internet world sort of on a plane with radio and TV right now, where you can get the motherhood and apple pie story, but how you get the real nitty-gritty is something we're going to have to deal with. Again, I think a progressive FCC could do it. I had hoped that the Wheeler Commission would do it. It's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. When I was there, I worked with a Democratic chairman as well as Republican to try to do something on this, but it just gets back to the gigantic power of the special interests and big money, and the politicians too, who don't necessarily want that kind of full disclosure and full transparency. But there are some on the Hill who are advocating we address this issue, and I am one of them. There's no reason people should not be informed about who's sponsoring these ads by corporations and think tanks and everybody else who are trying to make sure they have the upper hand.
Well, and you alluded to sort of a second ago, let's talk a little bit about social media. What the impact of adding, say, Facebook and Twitter into this mix, as well as others. Are there really any rules governing political ads on those platforms, or are there any in the works that perhaps...
Well, yes, there's legislation in the works that would bring some level of transparency. Again, not digging down to the area that I think is necessary to find out who the real money sponsors are, but at least to bring a little transparency into the situation. So that would be helpful, but in this era when special interests wield so much clout and all, it's an uphill battle. But God bless those people who are trying to do something about it.
Given your time on the commission, you saw a huge burst in technology. You had concerns early on about net neutrality and that kind of thing. What type of legislation moving forward do you think we need to fix the problems that we have, especially with what this FCC is putting forward?
Well, Ajit Pai, who's the current chairman, Donald Trump's chairman of the FCC, has been very successful in pursuing his ends, which are getting rid of public interest oversight and getting rid of regulations. Been one of the more successful people in the administration. Unfortunately, he's going backwards at warp speed instead of forward. So we need to have a Congress that can stop some of this. Hopefully, in 4 years, maybe we can get a commission with a different majority that will begin to think a different way. And then over and above that, we really need to answer some of the more fundamental questions regarding the internet that go beyond just net neutrality. We need that net neutrality as the prerequisite of an open internet, but that doesn't solve the other challenges the internet has presented us with, like commercialization and consolidation and the lack of news and information. Isn't it interesting that Facebook and Google, where a lot of people turn to for their news, and those companies run news that are produced by other people, often newspapers or television stations or whatever, and they make billions of dollars with the ads on the side. When people look at those news broadcasts, what do they give back to the craft of journalism? Well, they can say, well, we did this project here, this project there, but in comparison to the billions and billions of dollars they're raking in on the news, they're contributing very little back. So we need to, what's the role on another internet question of artificial intelligence, and how's the internet going to affect our jobs and our lives? These are all really serious questions, and those are questions that our society should be addressing. Those are questions that the media should be teeing up, but instead, thanks to Ajit Pai, we're playing ping pong with net neutrality issues that should have been and really were settled years ago. Okay. But now he's undoing them.
Michael Copps, former FCC Commissioner, currently heads the Media and Democracy Reform Initiative at Common Cause, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Michael, we do appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
I appreciate the time and the great job you're doing covering these issues. Thanks very much.
And thank you, sir. We much appreciate that. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Peter Edelman, Michael Copps, and you. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.